Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat.
So serious.
Roll out.
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Welcome to this podcast review for July 9th, 2024. I am Brendan Cassidy, and joining me on this epic Western adventure as we gaze across the cinematic horizon, I have our very own writer and contributor over at In Session Film, as well as over at Cinefied, Benjamin Wiebe. Benjamin, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thanks for having me on, Brendan.
Yeah,
Super
we were
excited to talk about this movie.
I know we were talking offline a little bit, and I was digging through, mentally at least, digging through our In Session Film podcast archives. This is your first time on the In Session Film podcast. This is incredible.
Yeah, usually I love writing. I mean, I love talking. You're probably going to figure out that I ramble and ramble and ramble, but writing lets me be much more concise and lets me be much more focused. And so it's been a lot of my passion. But like, don't matter to me. I'm like, movies are movies. I can talk about them all day, every day. So it's exciting to be here.
The fact that you like talking means you're in the right place. The second we just started introducing to each other, like before we started recording this actual episode, I thought to myself, "Oh, thank God, we're going to be able to talk here. This is going to be great." So I'm really looking forward to this. And you have written some great pieces over at InSessionFilm.com as well over the years, from reviews to awards pieces. We really appreciate your work there. I particularly loved your review of Godzilla Minus One, which I know you were a big fan of. I love that we live in a world where we can get a movie like that as good as it was. I mean, that is just, it's an incredible film. I agree with everything you had to say about it.
Yeah, Godzilla Minus One might have been one of the best movies of last year. I remember making my top 10, not for an online publication, but for my university's school paper. Yeah. And it was like, how do you even make a top 10? And I live in Lethbridge, rural Alberta. You know, if I want to see an indie film at a theater, I have to drive 3 hours to go to Calgary, and you're going 120 the entire way. And it's just so much more work. So I'm like, oh, I guess it's all blockbusters. But like last year's blockbusters were so good. And to have a smaller blockbuster where it's like, yeah, it didn't really cost a blockbuster budget, but you wouldn't know watching it. That's phenomenal.
Well, I know. Hopefully Hollywood learns the right lessons about budgeting movies smartly. And we're seeing that a little bit, even as of late, we're seeing some well-budgeted movies that allow the profits to actually come in. Might not be the case for the film we're about to talk about today. It's a little bit of a different story. We're going to talk about how this is a very different set of circumstances, financially speaking, when compared to, let's say, the Inside Out 2s of the world. It's certainly not in that category. And with regard to the film we're about to talk about, if my calculations are correct, it's also one you're quite the fan of. So
Yeah, again, as someone who lives in Lethbridge, Alberta, and attends university in settler lands on Blackfoot Confederacy territory, there's always that concern. I am an educator. I am going and finishing a degree to teach. And it's like, how do we be socially aware of what's happened? And oh man, Canada, United States, sometimes you look at the history and you're like, oh goodness. And Lethbridge is settled like right nearby is a huge like Indigenous Peoples Reserve. And I was like, I don't know how I'm going to feel about this movie. I came in a little scared because Westerns have the connotation of the good white men and women deal with the savage, frontier that has to be made civil.
Sure.
And I was it's like watching Horizon. The first hour, I was so concerned because I'm like, we're starting and we're not changing that myth. And I'm like, I do not feel good recommending even a well-directed film if we're not dealing with the heritage of what this genre means. And then to have a scene with the Apache people actually having a discussion about what it means to live in the land and a part of a changing landscape was huge. I was like, this is rationalized. It doesn't feel like we're just, saying, oh, well, it feels like we're finally getting the not all bad people are bad that we typically get with like Aliens, where it's like Alien is this movie about how businesses are bad, and Aliens is like, well, not all businesses are bad, just
it's
the
more
one
nuanced
bad
than
guy.
that. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, so but like in that way, it won me over in small ways throughout, where I'm like, yeah, there's things
Yeah.
that are very good, and then there's things like it being a 4-part series that I'm like, okay,
Wow.
you
Yeah.
left it Yellowstone to make Yellowstone 2. At least you get to direct it this time.
This is where the circumstances of this film are so interesting and why they are so different than most movies we're going to get this year. And obviously, we're talking about the legendary Kevin Costner and his latest epic, Horizon, an American Saga, Chapter 1, which, as you noted, is going to be a 4-part series, with Chapter 2 already slated for release next month. So much like the Old West itself, we have a lot of ground to cover. So let's go ahead and lay the groundwork here. And I have a lot of things to say about this movie as well. So this is going to be a really interesting conversation. The film was co-written and directed by Kevin Costner, co-produced by Kevin Costner, and co-starring Kevin Costner, and was apparently a passion project of his dating back to, I think, 1988, if I'm not mistaken. And it was so much so that he invested $38 million of his own money into it, which I believe at this point only pertains to chapters 1 and 2. I think the third and fourth outings are not yet fully funded, but that makes this experience a rather interesting one, as we don't often see movies getting made this way. And it's not just in the scope of it. We'll certainly talk about how this works as a piece of cinema for sure, but it works as this type of long-term investment, with the promise that so much more is on the horizon, no pun intended. But yeah, we don't see movies like this anymore, at least in the way that it's treated. I feel like we almost have to treat this like a television program in some ways. And you mentioned Yellowstone. I think that is certainly no coincidence that he left that to make these epics. And as we'll discuss further, maybe that doesn't necessarily need to be a bad thing. If we talk about this as maybe like a television program like thing. The film features a monumentally stacked cast, including Costner, as well as, I got my notes here. Let's see if I can get everyone here that's worth mentioning. Sienna Miller, Sam Worthington, Jenna Malone, Abby Lee, Owen Crochew, Tatanka Means, Danny Houston, Michael Rooker, Scott Hayes, Tom Payne, Hella Hunt, Will Patton, Georgia McPhail, Luke Wilson, Isabel Furman, Michael Angario, Dale Dickey, Jamie Campbell Bower, John Beavers. Have I forgotten anyone? I feel like I've gotten the good bulk of who we at least need to give credit to in this movie.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I don't have my review up immediately, and I don't have the IMDb open because I'm a fraud, obviously. But no, there's the only other person I would add is the child actor that they have for that last sequence, because I think his performance in that final sequence is so monumental to what this movie is.
That is a great point. Great point. I don't have his name in front of me. I think we should try and uncover that as we're in the middle of the conversation and give credit to him. Because you're right. I think there are some interesting nuances that the film is going for, especially from his particular perspective. As far as child performances in this movie, maybe we should also at least call out Hayes Costner, Kevin's own son, who has a bit of a small role here. It is an affecting role nonetheless. And of course, probably no coincidence that Kevin's character here is also named Hayes. Maybe we'll get to that as well as far as the tribute there. I do want to lay a brief synopsis here before we get into our continued thoughts on the movie. Maybe this is where you can find the actor's name who plays that young boy at the very end of the film, Ben. But it's really hard to describe a film like this. On IMDb, it says it chronicles a multifaceted 15-year span of pre and post Civil War expansion and settlement of the American West. That seems to describe what's probably going to be the full saga and not just chapter 1. But as far as this first installment is concerned, it sets the stage with those ideas, with many intersecting threads and characters, many of which haven't even intersected yet, but we are at least being promised that they're going to. This movie is very much an introductory piece. It's kind of the first half of season 1 of a long show in many ways. And again, we'll talk about whether that's a good or bad thing, but might not necessarily need to be a bad thing. So, Ben, you already did a great job laying your thoughts out there as to what you think about this movie, especially with regard to its relation to the indigenous population and some of its other things. Why don't you talk about a few other things as to why you love this movie so much?
One of the big things is just its direction. I don't. It's hard to encapsulate, as you said, that there's like 5 different micro stories going on, and each sequence is at least really fun to be living in the moment for. I watched this and so I work as a movie theater worker right now, trying to pay bills, and I had a shift 5:45 start.
Yeah.
I was like, well, I gotta watch Horizon either today or tomorrow, and if it's the tomorrow, this was a few weeks ago before I'd reviewed it, it would be like a 9:50 start time for a 3-hour movie, and I'm like, all right, fine, we're gonna do it the day of. I'm gonna go into work at 2 p.m. so I can watch the movie and then start work immediately.
Yeah.
It was the fastest 3 hours of my life. Maybe not. Sorry, Heat. Yeah, Michael Mann's having a word with me here about Heat. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, good point.
Well, to be
but
fair,
it's really
Heat,
fast.
if I remember correctly, Heat is 2 hours and 50 minutes, so maybe it doesn't quite count.
Yeah. Like this flies by, and every scene feels just capsually engrossing. I was seeing some tweets where people were like, I've never seen a movie where I didn't know anyone's name except maybe Marigold and Hayes. Yeah, I know those 2 names, but all the other names don't know. But their face, oh, I know that guy. That's that scumbag who's hunting them down. That's his younger brother who's really angry the entire time. I think everyone has such a distinct look to them. And it comes from that cinematography where every sequence feels actually epic. Like it's worth the title of an epic movie.
For sure.
Because it feels so big to watch. And I really appreciate that. And it feels really well done on location. We don't see movies like this all the time. Got to celebrate the wins where we can get them.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't even know if I would call this a quote unquote film based on how we've sort of talked about how we need to see this as a different form of programming. But whatever this thing is, I kind of loved it, if I'm being honest. I don't know if I'm as high on it as you are, Ben. And much like any part 1 or chapter 1 in this case, my thoughts are going to feel somewhat inconclusive, as this is not a complete experience. That just comes with the territory. But why this chapter 1 did ultimately work for me comes down to a lot of what you're saying. It mostly is in Kevin Costner's direction, and it's more specifically his conviction and sincerity. This did not feel like any type of ego boost or any type of vanity project or anything like that. It simply felt like something he genuinely wanted to make because he loves these kinds of movies. That's really what the ethos is here. It's very old-fashioned. It's not reinventing any wheels. In fact, this would have maybe even felt a little bit derivative if it came out in the 1960s. Like, that's how traditional some of this feels. But I was still mostly wrapped up in it because that passion from Costner behind the camera specifically, that does come through. You sense it. You can feel it. And whenever a movie comes around that has those senses to it, regardless of how derivative it might feel, that ultimately fixes any type of problem that it could have in many ways. Like this does feel like something he genuinely wanted to make. And I think it also works because of how much it functions as a performance piece. The film is littered with, at this point now, and this is not a criticism in a way, it's kind of like something I'm interested to see go further. The film's kind of littered with pretty thin characters at this moment, if I'm being honest. Many of whom I can't even tell you their character names without going to Wikipedia or IMDb. Sienna Miller, I think she's great in the movie. I can't name her character. Is Kittredge or something like that? It's like I can't name these characters, but they're well cast because they're familiar faces and they have particular personality traits and types that allow you to at least latch on to what their plights are. And many of these actors are doing the work to make you want to see what's in store for them next. And that's all that you really need in a chapter 1 like this. There's a lot of other thoughts I have as well. I will also echo a lot of what you had to say about the film's indigenous representation. I have more thoughts on that later. But yeah, I was kind of won over by this, and I was surprised to see that I was genuinely excited for part 2 when it comes out in August. I did not expect that. I don't think it's a perfect experience. There are things that I'll criticize later on in this conversation, but this film is just such an enigma compared to what we usually get nowadays, and I have to respect it for that.
Yeah, well, I mean, one of the big things for me, I did find the kid's name. Etienne Khaleesi, I think is how you say it. I
Okay.
don't know, but
Well, tried.
yeah, just as you say, paper thin characters, but with very discernible traits.
Yes.
Very, very well costumed. I praised it in my Cinefied review, and I
Mhm.
stand by it. These are characters that have a look, have a feel, and you get thrust into a scene with them where they're interacting at a barnyard or like a barn dance or something like that, like just a
Mhm.
great ball. And
Yeah.
you're like, I don't know who any of these guys are. Why would I care? And then they have this micro moment of conflict that you begin to cheer for an underdog, which then leads
Yeah.
into a bigger conflict. And it does a really, I think it's part of that pacing that it emotionally latches you on, not through what
Mhm.
they're saying, but just through their need to survive. I think this is a very American and like North American spiritual film because it feels like it's about
Mhm.
living in a very hostile territory where it's not always the people that are hostile, but it's the land itself that is hostile to change and learning to change.
Right.
And for that, I'm deeply engrossed in this. As a part one, this story has so many limitations that I'm like, yeah, I don't know where things are going to resolve,
Mhm.
which is a problem. I do
Sure.
think this feels like a TV series. It feels um, like a part of a mini series, but I don't think it has the detail per se that a mini series like a Stranger Things would have.
Sure.
Right?
Sure.
Yeah, Stranger Things episodes 1 to 4 would probably have 5 different things happen where different plot lines all align and you begin to see who these characters are. Here, we're
Mhm.
introduced to 5 different characters, but just through simple problems. Whether
Yeah.
it's you're on the Oregon Trail and you've got these very rich, aristocrats who kind of are like asking other people to fetch them water. You're like, wow,
Yeah.
okay, that immediately paints a picture of who these people are and the conflict that's going to come out of that,
Yeah. For
despite the
sure.
fact that I know very little about them. And it's deeply fascinating how easy it is to watch,
Yeah.
um,
Absolutely.
in spite of those problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you said is really important because we keep talking about how this is maybe more similar to something like a television program. Maybe we have to treat it as such, but I wouldn't say it feels episodic. Like it doesn't feel like you're spending time with certain characters only for that to conclude, then to shift gears to another arc or something like that. It doesn't feel like a series of vignettes, but at the same time, not much happens either. It's really more of a movie of intersecting dialogues and gestures is really what this is. It's kind of a movie to vibe with in a way, and I like that it's almost hangouty in a way, which I don't know if that was Kevin Costner's intent, but it does come off that way. At least it did for me, and I sort of respect that this is a film that's more about sort of finding a place to sit within the classic Western tropes to maybe do some new things with it. I love what you were saying earlier in this conversation about how maybe it's almost deconstructing some tropes. It brings them up in a way that feels very visually familiar, but it sort of starts to pull the rug back a little bit as we get new perspectives within these multi groups of people, and I found that really interesting, especially with regard to its indigenous representation. And I'm certainly not an expert in that topic. I'm not the one to talk to, to really be the one to say if this film is perfectly accurate or if it's problematic. But I will say, from what I know, it is refreshing that we at least get to see their point of view to some degree, and it seems to set itself up in a way where you might not think it's going that way. Like you said, you think, okay, this is the traditional sort of setup. This is the traditional good versus evil mentality with a lot of these classic westerns. And Kevin Costner has even said that he sort of did this deliberately because he wanted to showcase that both sides of this feud have a right to be as angry as they are. And we get these battling perspectives, sometimes even within the same group of people. Uh, I assume that we'll get more from characters such as, and I'm going to try and pronounce their names. I hope I can get them right, but uh, uh, Piansene and Taklisham, both portrayed by Owen Crowshoe and Tatanka Means, respectively. I think we'll get more of them in Chapter 2, and so on for sure. But the fact we at least get a glimpse of their characterization is a step in the right direction. And I like the idea that the Apache are now even in disagreement with each other. How they're sometimes forced to battle their own kind just to survive due to this feuding war that's now overtaking this land. It's very much reminiscent of something like Princess Mononoke in a way that showcases different sides, but actually has a point of view for each side, kind of confuses you as an audience member to question where your allegiance is supposed to lie. And really the answer is none of the above, but also all of the above. I think that's a really fascinating way of going about it. And the way that the film also treats the invasion of this land as a cultural disruption for them, almost like it's affecting their religiosity, I think is another nice point of view. So it's certainly maybe not the most perfect representation in that regard, but I love that it's at least aiming for a new perspective or an added perspective that we don't always get.
Mm-hmm. And being in co-development with Territory Pictures certainly helps, actually having Indigenous people coming into these roles and being able to influence that story. Something I want to add to that is how this film starts from the perspective of two kids and ends with the perspective of a kid. The two kids at the beginning of this film are two of our Indigenous individuals. And this is, again, it's these minute, really small filmmaking details that make me really adore this picture, because I'm like, yeah, the story as a whole is pretty thin. The characters are pretty thin, but you get these themes and these ideas that are created where they echo each other in rhyme with such just naturalness. It feels natural that it would rhyme.
It's
in a
smooth.
way
You're
that
right. It's a very smooth experience in that regard.
Yeah, where you're like, a lesser filmmaker would not have thought to do this. Wouldn't have realized that this is what they're going for. And I think there's this idea of kind of old versus new that's created through it, because these two kids at the beginning of the film are Indigenous children, and they're seeing some white settlers starting to settle into Horizon. They're measuring out the territory with their sticks to get into stick stuff so they can put up their tents. And they're like, what are they doing? Well, they're playing a game. And I really love how they try to understand this event from their perspective, where they're watching them before their older individuals within that tribe are going to go and take out all these white settlers that have starting to take this land. Whether or not that is correct or not is a moral and ethical dilemma outside the scope of the film, but it really does an effective job of categorizing these kids as watching with curiosity and almost this hope that there is reconciliation here before it eventually is going to go away. And you get the same thing very much at the end of the film where, who's Etienne's character? I don't know the name. The small boy, Russell Gans. That's the name of the character. But he has to watch, as a bunch of some white settlers from early in the film are trying to find Pionsene, who led an attack on their Horizon settlement. And some other events happen. I don't really know all the details of why they are like, you know what, we're just going to take whatever we can. I think they're running out of money, something of the sort. But like there's a sequence where there's a raid on an Indigenous village, and where there's a bunch of like celebration and macho-ness and like the scalping of people. Right. And it's very like, again, you see the celebrations from the older actors, almost like this, like, oh man, look at this, we're taking back the thing. And you are contrasted with this kid watching in horror and terror at what's happening and his inability to process it. And I think that is the level of detail. And because we're coming from that kid's perspective, not from anyone else's, it makes this moment that, again, in a lesser filmmaker's hands or in a more traditional way, would be a historic victory, turns into a very sour tasting, this was for nothing.
Well, and that's a great
powerful.
Point. It really is, and it shouldn't work in a weird way. It shouldn't work because it is so paper thin, like you're saying. But only a good filmmaker would be able to find some emotionality through the vibe of it all. Like it creates a sensation that allows you to understand what's actually happening. I think one of the smartest things that Kevin Costner does as a filmmaker is that he allows the camera to basically be its own perspective decider, if that makes sense. So when we talk about that final battle between the white settlers and I guess the Apache specifically in that moment, we don't even see the battle. We only see the reaction from that child. And I think that is a beautiful touch to emphasize what you're saying. Again, to pull Princess Mononoke as a comparison into this almost feels like an origin story for someone like Prince Ashitaka. You know, that's someone that would actually be in the middle of this and seeing how the feud itself is essentially the problem. And I found that really fascinating too. And I think it's performed really well to emphasize those points even further. Were there any performances here that, like if you were to list through them, that you thought were like maybe more affecting than others? Like maybe who were some of the standouts for you in that regard?
Man, this is where, with a film where you can't even focus on characters, like it's so hard looking through an IMDb page. The hardest part of my review is talking about performances, because I'm like, the vibes are what I attach myself to in watching this.
Sure, that's fair.
Not really the characters. I think, again, you look at Marigold, who is played by
Abby Lee, I think it was.
Yeah, Abby Lee. A really simple performance, but I really appreciate between what Abby Lee is doing here. Is Hugh? I think Hugh is Tom Payne is the guy who's has the house. I think he's really fun in this role as
Hugh Proctor.
Trying to, like there's some really simple, again, character work here that I think goes a long way. Gotta love Jamie, the Jamie Bauer and where's the I hate having to look through epic movies because their IMDb list is like 40
I know, right?
long.
And especially when it's an IMDb list that also puts Giovanni Ribisi so high on the list, and he has literally one shot in this movie, not even a line. He's just there to set up what's going to happen with part 2.
Yeah, it's shoot me. John Beavers, Jamie Campbell Bauer. My gosh.
They're great. They're great.
I think they get my like standout outside of the Kittredge family. I think the Kittredge family and Sam Worthington are kind of this emotional heart that's like, to actually what Horizon is. And it pulls you through the majority of this film's runtime. But those two as antagonists for just one side of the story are so fun.
Yeah,
they're just really they you can smell them from across the scene, and you're like, these guys are greasy, dirty, and I don't like them, and they're so fun to watch because of that. So I don't know. Across the stage, they're all very good performances. It's hard to isolate.
Yeah, they're all mostly very good. I have one that was a bit distracting for me, and one that I was passively okay with. Maybe I'll just get to those right away, because I think the majority of these performances are good. I did not think Luke Wilson was very good here. I felt like he was the one that was maybe not able to transcend maybe what I keep seeing from a Luke Wilson type, and adapting to this world. And then there's Kevin Costner, the actor, not just the director. He's bringing his gruffy trademark mustache stoicism to this once again. And I think the issue I have with his performance is really more of an incomplete thought, because we haven't really seen him, his character of Hayes, really do anything just yet. It's almost like he knows I'm making this movie, so I'm saving my character for later. He is not introduced until over an hour into this, and that's not a hyperbole. That is an accurate, that's actually a fact. And even in this movie, he has one really good scene with the aforementioned I'm blanking on his name again. This is the beauty of a movie like Jamie Campbell Bauer. That shootout scene is very effective. And I think Campbell Bauer is probably carrying a lot of the thrilling weight for that scene. I think Kevin Costner's good there. I will say, if there is something effective about his performance in the right way, it does make me intrigued to see what comes next for Hayes. And if that's all he's trying to do here, then sure, that's great. I will agree, as far as standout performances, though, the Kittredge family, I think, are pretty great universally across the board. Sienna Miller is great. The one standout for me was Georgia McPhail as young Elizabeth. I thought she was terrific in some of those small roles that she has. Really tender, really has a lot of autonomy as well. Kind of the strong one when you would actually expect her mom to be that, especially the circumstances that they're found in. But she has a lot of agency, which I thought was really powerful. And I'll once again go back to Owen Crowshoe and Tataka Means. I thought were really quite great too. They have a moment, or at least one of them has a moment with the paternal figure for their people, and it showcases this disagreement that they have. And like that scene right there, I think is so important because it emphasizes that sense of deconstruction that we're talking about. That scene right there, I think, is where it really tells us as the audience, this might not be as traditional as you might think. It's going to go into a few different places and give you new perspectives, and you're going to have to own it. And I think that's really great.
Yeah, I 100% echo what you say there, right? I think the weird thing about a movie like this is that it's so long, and yet Owen Croshu and uh,
Tatanka means.
Tatanka means they only get that like two scenes, right? And
Yeah.
it's like, oh man, like it never, it doesn't lose its way when they have that space to shine.
Yeah.
Versus someone like Georgia McPhail, who has
Mhm.
so much room. The scorpion sequence,
Yeah. Simple but effective.
very simple, very well done. I like the quilt sequence with the flowers. I think
Yeah.
these are all areas where it just begins to really come together for me, where I'm like, I can look past weaker Luke Wilson performance and
Mhm.
Kevin Costner. He's here, but he's not the most interesting part of that, and I'm still gravitated and attached because there's still momentum in these sequences, and that's really powerful to me, is that this still holds your attention despite the fact that, yeah, he probably is introduced to last of the
Mhm.
major stories, probably 90 to 2 hours into the, or 90 minutes or 2 hours into the movie. I
Yeah.
want to say is when he actually becomes a character, and it doesn't feel like he's missing before
No.
it.
Yeah.
And I really appreciate a director who's willing to take that step back in their movie
Mhm.
that could be just about them,
Yeah.
which really nice.
Yeah, you
So
mentioned the word momentum. I think that's a great way to describe this. And I was so surprised about halfway through this, I realized I hadn't even checked my watch. And I went into this movie thinking, I hate to do this, and I hate to go into a movie with preconceived notions. That's not something I really ever do. But given the circumstances of this movie and knowing that it's really a movie that really depicts nothing happening outside of setup for chapter two, I've grown more cynical over the years as I've gotten older, and I kind of had this mentality: this is just not going to work for me. And in a way, I could actually, from an objective standpoint, peel this movie apart and really criticize the lack of, I guess, like the lack of traditional cinema norms that we tend to gravitate towards. I could easily do that, but I was just swept up in this thing, and it just made me happy. And I think a lot of the momentum really has to go to the editing here. Giving credit where credit is due, Miklos Wright does some really great editing here. Just like cinematically, there's so many great things here. The cinematography from J. Michael Murrow, and then the music by John Debney. All these things, I think, allow the film to just smoothly move as it does, to the point that it almost feels like there are no scenes here, no individual scenes. And I often say that sometimes the best movies, or the best edited movies, are ones where you don't even notice scene transitions, where it almost feels like the whole movie is just one continuous scene. This kind of feels like that, at least for the most part. A lot of that is that synergy between editing, cinematography, and music. We sometimes don't associate those other things as forms of editing, but they kind of are. I think this is yet another example of why that is. It is a very smooth experience, surprisingly.
yeah, I think you really nail it on the head when you're talking about like music and editing working together. The points where you notice the transitions is when we change storylines.
Yeah.
And you know what? There's things I don't like. We could talk about its television approach here, I think,
Mhm.
because to me, this does feel like something that's almost TV, but very much not, in a way that's very
Yeah.
odd, because it wouldn't work as like 3 episodes of a TV show,
Mm-mm.
um, because there's not really that much happening. Where we're getting time jumps between moments of character interaction, and there's not really arcs per se, but fleeting moments of character growth.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't make for a TV, but it makes for very engaging film.
Yeah.
And a lot of
That's a
that
good
has
point.
to do with the fact that we're getting sequences like the big attack at the hour point where the Apache
Mhm.
attack the first major Horizon
Yeah.
settlement, which
Great
is
scene. Great scene.
a 30-minute sequence that flies by in a snap of a finger. And it
Mhm.
doesn't, I think there are movies that feel, okay, I'm going to be really mean to Avengers Infinity War. I'm so sorry. I love it so much. But that feels like setup for Endgame, because it's really hard to watch one without the other.
Mhm.
And simultaneously watching Infinity War, you already know where it's going. The first time you watch, it's really engaging, super fun.
Sure.
You're like, yes, they can stop him. But every time after, you're like, Thanos is going to do this. Thanos is going to do this. He's got to show up. And so every scene begins to lose momentum. Here, because you have so much character death, a lot of characters here show up for a scene, maybe two, and then are gone for the rest of the movie. And I think it does a really good job at keeping these sequences engaging and engrossing, and creating these pockets of trauma for the main characters to have to process later through the films and through the chapters, which I think does a really good job at, again, emotionally hooking the audience to this film that is mostly vibes and like paper thin characters, while still being engaging.
Yeah.
And it doesn't work as TV. It only works as film, but it also doesn't work as a traditional movie and is very unique.
Such a great point as to where it like sits in this weird middle space of sorts that lacks any type of definition. When we say we have to treat this like a television program, it's more so the idea of it, but not necessarily the execution, because it's still edited like a movie. You can't really find pockets to cut this off and say, oh, this is where episode 1 is, this is where episode 2 is. It doesn't work that way. You probably get a 5-minute episode and then an hour and a half minute episode. It's in a way, you can almost say the movie is meandering, and some people might say that as a criticism, and I get that. I think that's certainly fair, but that's something I sort of appreciated about the movie. I think that's what contributes to the vibiness that we keep talking about. It just moves in such it moves in such a weird and different way.
Yeah, well, building on that, I love that you compare it to Princess Mononoke, because I do think there is a lot of that, like, very similar, like, again, movies that are dealing with history and colonialism and industrialization and these practices that define a territory in spite of the effects it does to the damages to the environment and our relationships with each other.
Yeah.
But also the vibiness
yeah.
of this cannot be understated, which again, very much, this might be the most meandering Western of all time, but I feel like it's also the biggest epic Miyazaki never made. Because it's outside of his wheelhouse.
It's the biggest,
but it's also, it feels like this and Luca feel like they're in the conversation for Western main movies that would be called, Miyazaki, or again, whether or not that's fully I don't know if it fully deserves that, because Miyazaki is such a master, and I'm like, Costner's really good, but like Miyazaki, like, who I can't compare my favorites like this, you know?
But it's a way to it's a way to find that kind of, frame of reference, to find that comparison point as to why this movie works in a similar way that an even greater movie also works. Like, in a way that this is kind of the biggest epic Western hangout movie in some ways, with major conflict surrounding it. First off, I have to just give you credit. I love that you mentioned Luca. That's probably a top 3 Pixar film for me. I wish people would acknowledge it as such. It is so good, but also kind of a hangout movie in many ways. It has a vibe, and as I've gotten older, I've responded to movies that are really about capturing a vibe and a sensation, and how film really does function as an art of moving pictures. And that is what this movie ultimately is. It is capturing that traditional art, but also in new ways. So much like the execution and the layout of it fits into this new weird space we're talking about. The intent and the thematic intent, the emotional intent also exists in this new space. And I have to give Kevin Costner credit for really challenging himself in a way. He waited so long to make this movie and finally got the chance to do it. He's going to lose money regardless. I mean, this was what? I think this was $100 million budget, but I don't know if this
110.
Was that for chapters 1 and 2, or just chapter 1?
No, it's just chapter 1.
All right, well, that's bad, because what was this, 11 million that it made over the first weekend?
Yeah, but also you see how Costner's talking about it on, like, in interviews. He's like, we're going to put it on TV. We're gonna make money on the retail, like, physical media sales.
Yeah.
And I think that long-term approach is where this does have an impact, right?
Yeah.
How many people are a part of that generation of Westerns that would no longer come out to a theater and in light of the pandemic?
He knows his audience. That's the thing. He knows his audience, and they're going to latch on to this. We have our own film Twitter bubble, And we think we're not the ones that are going to latch on to that because we're not part of that audience. His audience are those that are probably still going to try and find physical media at Best Buy and Walmart and stuff like that. And they're going to find a DVD copy of Open Range and they're going to want to buy that for $5. So in a weird way, what Kevin Costner is doing with these movies, it's almost like you're investing in a house. You know, you're investing in an asset. And that's what he's doing here. So the long-term side of it is what he's hoping to see a payoff in. In a similar way, Francis Ford Coppola is doing that this year with Megalopolis. He's putting his own money into it, hoping for a long-term investment out of it. And it's so interesting to see that in a world where cinematic success is driven by short-term results. And I this is such the antithesis to that.
Mm-hmm. Oh, for sure. And that's the other thing. I'm fascinated by this approach that's we're going to make 2 movies back to back, and they're targeting a demographic that is no longer considered the prime demographic, but simultaneously it's opening weekend. What was it competing with? Inside Out 2, I want to say.
Yeah.
Was the other movie it was come out with?
Despicable Me
Again,
4.
Again, it's competing with, but opening weekend was Inside Out 2.
That's true.
The theater I'm working at, Southern Alberta, basically the Texas of Canada. Everybody makes fun of it, and they're kind of right, and it kind of sucks sometimes. But the theaters that were selling out was Inside Out 2, and Horizon was pulling in a lot of our older demographic, and in really weird ways, where it's like, they don't come out to movies very often, but we're still selling in a theater that on a good day, like overall sales is like 1,000 tickets. It's like, our Horizon showings are getting 116 to 200 people. Sucks for me cleaning it because I'm like, oh my goodness, please take your garbage out. But simultaneously, I get to feel really enjoyed about it because I'm like,
it's so
it's
bittersweet.
Inside Out.
It's a double-edged sword.
It's not like Inside Out where an entire family's coming. It's just 1 or 2 people coming to this movie, and they're like, let's go watch it, and paying full price for it. And I think it will find its audience, and especially with how it's funny that you mentioned, like, I don't think it would work as TV or a mini episodes, because it sounds like Costner kind of wants to release it as a mini series at some point. And I'm like,
I don't know
how. I want to trust you, but I'm like, are you going to mix like parts of part 1 and part 2 together?
You have to re-edit this thing. You have to completely re-edit it. It's kind of like what they did with the Godfather saga by completely reshaping parts 1 and part 2 to be its own like television experience as opposed to just a cinematic experience. You have to completely reshape it all.
And I don't know how that'll be, but I'm also very fascinated by it because I'm like, I don't know who else is doing this, and I'm willing to take risks on film for art's sake. Yeah. I think, like, especially when we're on film Twitter, and maybe this is a little more like, what would you call it? Like theoretical or not physio, but philosophical, right? We're talking about movies on Twitter, and so much of the conversation is box office. Oh, how much money did it make? Is it going to win the Oscars? And I'm like, I don't know. Is it going to win the Oscars? I'm not in the Academy. I wish. Yeah. Portrait of a Lady on Fire should have won something. But hey, France, whatever. Les Mis 2019. You do your thing.
Hey, as long as you have those movies to latch on to, all we care about is like, okay, do we love the movie? Can we hold on to it? Yeah, that's all we care about.
And that's it. As consumers, why are we focused on the numbers outside of will another one get made? Which, surprise, we know the next one's already done. And so I'm like, I'm at least happy we got 2. I'm hoping that it ends in some way, shape, or form that's kind of reconcilable, so that when, eventually some studios like, we're not going to fund the next 2 parts of this. At least we have something that is finished. But simultaneously, I think this is such a thematically coherent piece that I'm like, as a piece of vibey hangout movie, I don't even know if I need part 2 to be good. I'm like, you know what? Sure, the story, the paper thin characters, all of that. But as a vibe, I had a great time with it. Yeah. And if this was the best part of it and everything else sucks, I got a good movie.
Well, Kevin Costner has said he is going to be making Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 regardless. He said he's going to find a way. Even if they aren't funded yet, he's going to find a way. So maybe that means Chapter 2 will not be as conclusive as you're saying. Maybe it won't quite have that stamp of finality. In a way, I kind of hope it does, because I think that'll help differentiate it from how Chapter 1 ends with a literal sizzle reel. Let's talk about that sizzle reel before we get to the end of this
funniest
episode.
thing.
I'll just lay my cards out there. It did not work for me. That sizzle reel really did not work for me. That's probably my biggest problem with the movie, but I'm curious how you thought of it.
Oh, I find so it has this recurring motif of printing press.
Yeah.
And the first time because you don't get a really nice, like opening shot of it, and because no one in my generation knows what a printing press is. I wish I did. I work for a paper at a university where we use a printing press, but also I've never seen it. It's like, I don't know what this is. And about 2 minutes in, I was like, oh, they're printing the flyers. Duh. And I had like that moment, and I was like,
pulling them in. Yeah.
I'm like, I don't think it fully works. I think it is like a next time on.
It is. It's
teaser.
a very egregious example of tune in next week for Horizon. That's basically what it feels
simultaneously, like. I do love this, like the introduction of just two random New York guys who are like, yeah, we're just trying to sell this land just to anyone, make some money off of it. It's like, man, I love that you are once again talking about the exploitative powers of capitalism. In a new land. Amazing inclusion for 20 seconds. That's very funny to me. But 100%, like half the people I know who are watching that movie, like once the sizzle reel started going, like just started standing up and we're like, yeah, we're done, we're good. And I'm like, okay, pull it. I'll wait till the credits start to pull out the phone, do the letterbox review, and get out of here.
Yep, it's a legit trailer to end the movie, and I am really curious what they do with that that capitalistic thing you're talking about, because there was something I really liked about how this land, which is called Horizon, that's what they call it, almost had this mythical, almost fantastical quality to it. But now we're learning, okay, there actually is something practical around these individuals just trying to sell the land. And maybe they don't know the ramifications that it's leading towards. Maybe they do. Like that could be a fascinating question. With regard to the sizzle reel itself, I just think it gives us too much. I feel like I've seen chapter 2 already. And I feel like I don't want to say it spoils things, but it leads to certain character interactions that I thought, oh, wait, these two people already kind of hate each other. Now you're suggesting that they're going to kiss and make up, so to speak. It's like, I didn't want to know that now. And I think it gives way too much away. And I found that really deflating, honestly. I was so excited for chapter 2. In fact, I am still excited for chapter 2. That sizzle reel made me slightly less excited for it, because I just think it gave too much.
My counter to that is the stagecoach shootout seems like such a hype sequence that I'm like, what?
Sure.
You didn't
I'll give
like
you that.
I'm sorry. I didn't know it was going to come, and you are showing me we're going to have a stagecoach shootout with like, I'm like, yeah, okay. Everything else kind of seems like, we're going to steam it up, get it hot and steamy. Like there's going to be some real spicy stuff going on. I'm like, I don't care about that. The characters, man, whatever. Who cares? Give me the shootout. I want to see that. Like that's the funny thing. I'm like, yeah, you know what? This doesn't really. I think it's introducing ideas in really subtle ways, or maybe I'm just reading too much into it. Maybe it never will talk about really the exploitation, but I think they already kind of talk about it when the older sergeant has his little moment with it's not his last name's not Kittredge. Oh shoot, with Trent Gifford.
Oh, Sam Worthington, the lieutenant. Yeah,
the lieutenant, and he has this moment talking about how it's this. Everyone comes to Horizon thinking, "Oh, that was just last guy's problems, but we're gonna be different," which is a great. It's a meme format, obviously, but I do think there's something honest, and there's that authenticity. That I'm like, you know what? There are moments of flamboyance here that I don't love. A sizzle reel that has not much to it. Yeah. But that authenticity is so rich that I'm like, yeah, I didn't expect that from a 3-hour epic 4-part
it takes pauses. It takes pauses for melancholy, for those moments of tranquility. I love that speech from Danny Houston there, because he speaks to the inevitability of what's going to happen to the Apache, regardless of whether they know it or not. And he speaks to it in a way that doesn't come off as villainous. It's more so just, this is the reality, and they sadly don't know it. Like they might put a pause on these efforts, but white settlers are still going to come regardless. And I think it's powerful.
I love his final line there where he's like, I sure hope it doesn't happen in our time.
Yeah.
Like having this sadness about losing the frontier in this very, I understand it. It's like, kind of the trad wife memes where it's like, oh, what if you could live in a past? but it's like, no, they are living in this, troublesome, hostile territory, but also it's the only life they know how to live. And they're
Yeah.
like, I really hope we get to see, we die having before it becomes like the rest of the Eastern landscape.
Sure.
Whether Europe or whether the US is one nation or two, right? I think it's fascinating. Really, really smart.
Yeah.
So
I'm with you. I'm with you on that. Do you have any final thoughts here as we wrap up this conversation on Horizon and American Saga Chapter 1?
Oh, if you are wanting to have a good vibe time about, just the procedure, the process about how you live life in the West, yeah, sure, go check it out, please. I can heartily recommend it. That's the thing. Most of the time I watch a movie, I'm like, what does it say? How does it say it? All of that. And this, I'm just like, yeah, no. If you think you will like a Western, if you are someone who's like me, who's got a Last of Us poster in his back because the frontier is just a fascinating setting, this is fun. This is great. And I recommend it. I gave my recommendation on Cinefied because I think it has a lot of deconstruction elements that are unique to a Western in 2024. And if this is the type of movies we want to see more of, maybe not the bloated 4-part of it, but traditional, done new and thoughtfully, just go support it. Support your local theater chain. Don't wait for it to come on Netflix.
I think that's a great way to end it on. I hope people check it out. I'm at a point now where even if I love a movie, that doesn't necessarily mean I recommend it because I know certain audiences only go for certain things. There are movies I love, for instance, that I wouldn't even recommend to members of my family, for instance. Going back a few years, I loved Sean Baker's Red Rocket. I don't think I recommended that to anybody outside of just myself, but it was, I think I put it at number 3 in that year that it came out. I love that movie so much. Even my dad asked me about it, and I said, "Yeah, don't watch that. I don't think you'll like it. It might not be for you." I think my dad
Girl
would
with the Dragon
enjoy it.
Tattoos in my top 4. So movies that you're like, I love this movie, but I cannot recommend having a bad time to anyone else. It happens all the time.
Yeah, you have to know what you're getting into. But I'm with you. I could certainly recommend this one, especially for those who know what they're getting into, and just the overall idea of how this movie got made and how it compares to the traditional ways movies are measured nowadays. I think this is an important one. I think it's a really fascinating one as well. So I'm liking this more as time goes on. I think this conversation even solidified certain things that I did like, but now like even more. So I really appreciate this conversation that we had. It's like making me like it even more. Great movie and a great you can really do that.
Yeah, it's my magic power. I make people think about things sometimes too much. It's a curse because I'm like, I don't like this movie, and people are like, why? And then I'm like, oh, you don't want to know because you're not going to be able to like it after. And then they'll watch a movie with me, and they're like, that's cheesy. That's too this, and I'm like, have you thought about this? And they're like, and I'm like, yeah, see, in reality, Cat in the Hat.
I think good film criticism is about offering a new perspective that makes you think, never thought of it that way. Maybe I don't agree, but I never thought of it that way. I think that's a really great way to end it on. And for those listening, if you have seen Horizon and you agree or disagree with what we just had to say about it, let us know. Leave a comment on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And if you're watching us on YouTube, you can, of course, leave a comment below. Be sure to rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. It really helps out the show. And of course, you can email us any thoughts you have at insessionfilm@gmail.com. With all of that said, Benjamin, thank you so much for being here. It was great to finally get you on in podcast form. This was lovely, man.
Hey, thank you, Brendan, for having me on. It was a lot of fun. My house may be too hot for the headphones, but the time flies by and I didn't even glance. So we're doing great.
It didn't stifle any of the conversation, so we're still in good shape there. Why don't you tell us about some of your great work that you've done and where we can find you on social media?
Yeah, sure. I've been doing a lot of different stuff. I love talking about movies. I love writing about movies. I contribute to In Session Film. It's been a hot minute, but I've got 2 retrospectives on movies that are turning 10 and 20, I think. I'm going to be talking about Dawn of the Planet of the Apes and explicitly
love it so much.
A very good movie. I'm going to talk about the power of voice and speaking in that movie because of how much of a Kingdom of the Planet of the Apes, fine, decent movie, whatever, but the apes talk all the time. And I'm like, no, the reason that Dawn works is that they don't. And I think there's an element of stuff to it, but I really missed it in watching, in seeing Kingdom. So I'm like, I want to talk about that. And I think it's born supremacy. Born Supremacy, Born Ultimatum, Born
Identity was
I think
the
it's
first
Supremacy.
one. Yeah,
I think it's
Supremacy is the
Supremacy
second one.
that I'm going to be covering and talking about,
Oh, nice.
phenomenal movies. But yeah, you can follow my works on In Session Film. I love it. I love talking about movies. My Batman stuff might be my favorite stuff. So if you're a Caped Crusader fan, take a look at that. Cinefied, I contribute every now and again. Well, not every now and again. I'm a monthly contributor there, usually covering Shudder movies because I live in a place where I don't get anything else. And everyone's like, hey, I have the screener to Glass Onion. And I'm like, actually, I did cover Glass Onion. Bad example. I have a screener to Godzilla vs. Kong. And I'm like, oh, okay, well, guess I'm going to cover, I don't know, Speak No Evil, which was a phenomenal movie. And now we've got an English remake, which we'll see.
We'll see.
But yeah, it's there, and Film Wiebe on Twitter. I think it's film_Wiebe, if I remember correctly. But like, I'm sure we'll have a pin there or something for people who are actually looking for it. But
absolutely.
Yeah, I'm everywhere and nowhere, and yeah,
that's a great way to say it. Great way to say that. And for those listening, if you're not following Ben's work, you really should. Some great pieces over at InSessionFilm.com. I did love your review as well for Horizon over on Cinefied. I think it's really great written content, so I applaud you there. I love that you say you're a really big Caped Crusader fan, and I'm actually not sure what the answer is to this question. What is your favorite Batman movie?
No, you don't do me like this.
I have to.
I'm going to turn into a fraud. I haven't seen the. So for context, there are a few that I have not seen. A lot of the Kevin Costner's, or not Kevin Costner, Kevin Conroy. I think that's the name. How you say it. The animated series I have not seen because I grew up in a very specific household that Two Towers was too scary for mom. For context, I didn't see Lord of the Rings till I was 17. And we had to watch it in the basement when mom was not around.
Wow.
But no, and I think The Dark Knight is obviously a perfect picture. I think it's probably The Dark Knight, honestly.
Okay.
I think The Dark Knight Rises is very much a movie that, like myself, has moments of depression where I'm like, I want to feel bad, and I watch The Dark Knight Rises because I really like it. Because sad movies are my jam. But yeah, it changes all the time. It's just, they're all good. You know what? Sure, even the rubber pants suits, the Joel Schumacher days. Yeah, I wrote about a defense of them. They're fun. They're mythos movies. Let's go.
They've gotten better as time has gone on, I feel like, just given the landscape of superhero movies now. And that's not to knock superhero movies now, but you look back at the 90s, it was just such a different thing, such a different time capsule of a thing that you kind of have to appreciate the ridiculous cheesiness of those movies, like, because nothing else was like it.
No, and they're mythos movies. I love the idea of the myth and mythologizing and saying superheroes are our new Greek and Roman gods. Might be the greatest grand statement made in the last 50 years about pop culture in America.
That is poetry right there.
But it rules, and you know what? Sure, sometimes the line delivery is really bad. I'm just saying, you got Tommy Lee Jones giving a performance that really he shouldn't have, and Arnold is Mr. Freeze, I guess. But hey, you know what? He was actually having like some major like battery acid problems with his mouth, so I don't really critique them.
Valid excuse.
But like, man, I don't know. Dark Knight. It's all of them. They're all good.
Yeah.
So.
Batman Returns for me, the Michael Keaton film from 1992, because that's a great tragedy waiting to happen. It's almost Shakespearean in that regard. I love that film so much. I think it's one of the greatest superhero movies ever made, and that's why I was curious what yours were as well. But yeah, Dark Knight, you can't go wrong with that. It's a great film for all of those reasons that pretty much everyone would agree upon. Great stuff there. And once again, if you're not following Benjamin's work, you really should be. Great content over at In Session Film and Cinefied. Great content coming soon. Be on the lookout for that. And I believe that is it. For those of you listening, be sure to check out our upcoming review of Maxine. It may already be out as we're recording this, or it might be coming out very soon, so be on the lookout for that. But also be sure to check out episode 593, where JD and I concluded our 1940s Best Picture Winners series. That series will, of course, continue once we decide on which decade we want to focus on next, but we had a lot of fun talking about the 1940s there specifically. Really great stuff, more great stuff to come. Benjamin, thank you so much for being here once again. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast.